it would be helpful both to the Minister and the Chair in making our judgments if the members could refer to the sub-clauses that they're referring to. Stuart Nash.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Chair, there are two areas of this bill I'd like to talk about, but the first one is actually to back up Ron Mark of New Zealand First. Now, this is supplementary order paper set down by Ron Mark, and thank you to the Minister for outlining the IRD's response to this, but if I could just, if you could indulge me the right to reply to that. The Minister did mention that in 2010 there were a change in rules around depreciation of buildings, and what the IRD has said is that buildings don't normally depreciate, and therefore, it really doesn't make much sense. But the thing is, Mr Chair, that seems a very Auckland or Wellington-centric view. There are a whole lot of small places in provincial New Zealand, like Eltham.
I'm going to interrupt now, and I'm going to apologise to the member for interrupting him and not interrupting the Minister. But a discussion about depreciation changes that happened 5 or 7 years ago is actually not relevant to this. I mean, a vague passing reference would be fine, but we can't. The member can debate either the part or Mr Mark's SOP. But I think I want to reiterate my apology for not interrupting the member, the Minister. But we just can't let this debate go on, because we could have another hour on things which are not relevant now. Stuart Nash. A point of order, Inez Galloway.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I just noticed that while you were ruling, the clock was running. I just want to ensure that Mr Nash gets his full time.
And that is my instruction. That when I interrupt a member because they're not being relevant, then the clock will run. And if there's another point of order, generally the clock will stop, but I will still make a judgment. And a couple of members might have noticed they were stopped early, their speeches weren't terminated, they just didn't get credit for good behaviour. Stuart Nash.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I mean, the reason I did mention this is the heart of Mr Mark's SOP is, and I'll quote this, to redress significant tax disadvantages faced by commercial, industrial, residential and heritage property owners when looking to bring buildings above earthquake threshold required by the Building Act. Now, what the Minister actually said, Mr Chair, is that the IRD believed that they were actually creating almost another building. I think those are the Minister's words, and I think she meant to say that. And I get that on one perspective, but what we've done with the change in without changing legislation, and it might have been in unintended purposes, is we've taken a building that was within code, so it was legal. There was nothing wrong with that building, and it was valued as such. And we have actually changed the law to move that building from being legal to now being illegal. And so you could I could mount a counter-argument that, in fact, what the IRD has done by actually changing the law has taken a building and again moved it into another category. So that's counter to what the Minister was saying. And what we actually may see here, Mr Chair, is something that Mr Mark alluded to, but it could be slightly worse than that. Mr Mark has said in his supplementary order paper, and I quote, "Without this amendment, many buildings may be demolished without replacement, especially in provincial New Zealand." Now, the reason that may happen is because the cost of actually rehabilitating that building or getting it up to code is more than the value of that building. But I see a scenario where it could actually be worse than that. Let me give you an example. A building in Waipawa, and this is not a real-world example, just a hypothetical one, has got a value, and I do know Waipawa because it's a quaint little town with nice heritage buildings, but it might have a commercial value of $200,000. The cost to remediate that building is $300,000. That building is held in a separate company, as these things tend to be these days, and instead of the building owner saying, "I'm going to pull down the building," what that building owner may actually say is, "I'm going to walk away from this company. So not only am I not going to demolish this, I'm going to leave this." So at some point in time, the council will be, the territorial authority will have a statutory requirement to either make that building safe or pull it down. So the onus moves from the owner of that building to actually the ratepayers in the council. So I can see a potential scenario where, in fact, that building is not pulled down by the owner, but is actually, it's a cost incurred by the council as they have to pull the building down themselves. And if I'm right in saying, and Mr Mark may correct me on this, I think the government has given buildings in provincial areas 10 years, or councils in provincial areas 10 years to remediate any building that doesn't come in code. And if I come to my hometown of Napier, which of course was rebuilt after the 1931 earthquake, if a building was built before 1935, it automatically is discounted by, I think, 20% in terms of, Mr Chair? Mr Chair?
Stuart Nash.
Thank you. Automatically depreciate by 20% on what constitutes being in code. So there are two things I would say to the Minister's response to this SOP. The first one is, has the IRD a mandate to actually look at the social cost of not implementing a piece of legislation? And if so, how do they quantify that? Because I think what Mr Mark, and I don't want to put words in Mr Mark's mouth, obviously, but I think what Mr Mark is talking about here is not only the fiscal cost, but the social cost that that a council or a town might incur if, in fact, this isn't allowed to be expensed. Because this is a problem all over New Zealand. I visited a gentleman in Eltham and he owned half the block. Now, it's just not worth him spending the money getting that up to code. The other thing I would like to say on this is $12 million over 4 years put forward by the Heritage Fund, and that's very generous, and I commend them for that. But I think $12 million, so let's roughly say it's $3 million a year. Sure, but just answering the Minister's...
That's right. You can't answer an irrelevancy with an irrelevance.
Sure. But that is possibly about 3 or 4 buildings a year. So it doesn't address the problem in any way, shape or form. Mr Chair, the other thing I would like to briefly allude to is a clause in this bill, clause 42, which actually covers DW5 and all the sections on that through to DW6. It's about aircraft operators, and it's aircraft engines and aircraft engine overhauls. Now, this is we had a really interesting debate in the Select Committee. This was brought forward by David Seymour. I don't know if Alan Gibbs had said I had a problem with my airport maintenance, but I wouldn't like to say that at all. But what this actually does, Mr Chair, is it's a sensible amendment. There's no doubt about that. But there are some, I suspect, unintended consequences. Now, the reason I say it's a sensible amendment is because the engine of an aircraft needs a much higher level of maintenance than, say, the body of an aircraft or the wheels or any other part of an aircraft. And rightly so. Rightly so. I don't want to disagree with that. But what this actually requires now is the purchaser of an aircraft to actually separate the value of the value of the engine from the value of the aircraft itself. And I'm assuming there is a simple model that will allow the sellers of aircraft to do this, or insurance assessors who look at aircrafts and say, okay, what we can do is let's have a model, and it's not in here, Mr Chair, but I'm making a hypothetical assumption here that the engine of the aircraft is worth, let's say, 50% of the whole aircraft itself, and therefore if you're purchasing an aircraft for $10 million, the value of the engine is $5 million. I don't know if it's as simple as that, and the Minister may well know. If it is as simple as that, then it makes this a little easier to implement. If it's not as simple as that, then I am really interested to know how the Commissioner of the IRD is going to deal with this when someone comes in and says, I bought an aircraft for $10 million, it consists of a little bit of aluminium, some rivets, a little bit of leather, and a really big engine, because without that engine this thing doesn't get off the ground, therefore I reckon it's worth about 90% of the value of the aircraft. If that occurs, then the Commissioner of the IRD, I believe, is going to be forced to rule on some standardised model that will allow aircraft owners and aircraft engine maintainers to comply with, because it could be all over the place. Now, when we look at this, it actually, there are certain things you're not allowed to do. For example, if you buy an aircraft, like one of those old Harvards that I think the Air Force uses for their trick planes, if you buy an aircraft and you just maintain the engine for standard use, that's fine. But if you want to modify the engine, then you can't claim anything back, which sort of makes sense in a way, but Yeah, sort of interesting as well. It does include gliders, which is good to know. Richie won't be under any more tax obligations. But the other thing also, it's interesting here because, and I'll read this, this is DW5 part 3, and it talks about deduction of aircraft engine when acquired for price. Now the wording is very interesting here. It says, if the person acquires, other than an unpriced aircraft engine with an aircraft engine for use with the aircraft, the person has a deduction. Now, the wording that's interesting is other than an unpriced aircraft engine with an aircraft. And I suspect what was happening, Mr Chair, is a whole lot of people were buying an aircraft and saying, oh, the engine's just part of it, it's not unpriced. That's why I say a new model is going to have to come into existence.
Mr Chair.
Mr Chair.
Jamie Lee Ross.
I move that the question be now put.
Oh, no, I think we've had a bit of original stuff. Ron Mark.